Hello, YouTube. Today I'll take you on a small journey to show you the Russian Atlantis research. I've done other videos about aspects of it. Today I want to tell you something else. It's a fascinating account. Let me start by saying that the Russian Society for the Study of the Problems of Atlantis is an all-Russian scientific research public association founded in 2003 by three people. One of them was Voronin, the other one Sherbakov, who passed away, as have Voronin too, and Wojciechowski and Nefedyev. Well, Alexander Voronin was its first president. He published an article titled Metaphysics and Science in the Life of Yarina Haug-Meister. And I'll discuss this today. I think you'll find it interesting, but I will add my comments as we go along too, to make it easier and maybe a few corrections. By the way, years ago I've corresponded with Voronin on a number of occasions, and like I said, he passed away in the year 2013. So basically what I'm going to tell you today, it's like the account about Russian and other people from the former Soviet Union and Russian Empire engaged in the search for Atlantis. So at some points we'll deal with espionage, underground research, Soviet top brass, occult and metaphysics. All part of this tale. The impetus for the revival of interest in Atlantis in the USSR, so that's after the communists took over control of the country, decades after actually. There was a discussion of major Soviet scientists and writers on the pages of the Technika Молодежи magazine in the year of 1956 under the title, Did Atlantis Exist? Famous scientists and writers took part in the discussion. Among them was Ivan Yefremov, Zhirov, and Haug-Meister. Yefremov and Zhirov I have described in my earlier videos, as well as the magazine itself, Technika Молодежи, a wonderful magazine where we, Soviet people, had a chance to learn about UFOs, mysteries of history, ancient aliens, to an extent. But the editors were brave people. It is difficult to imagine to some why it was in the USSR and not abroad that researchers first started talking about Atlantology as a science, the study of Atlantis. After living in the West for years and having observed how debunkers and official science establishment react to such subjects, I'm not surprised. But life was not easier at all in the Soviet Union because you also had ideological constraints and the official Marxist-Leninist ideology and all that. So this phenomenon remains to be studied, but the truth, like a beautiful flower, most often grows where the totalitarian regime manifests itself in its ugliest forms. Those are the words of Voronin, and I completely agree with him. This is evidenced, he continued, by a small anonymous note entitled The Soviets and Atlantis, published in the British magazine Atlantis in 1956. Here is its full text. Without much pleasure from our note, one can come to the conclusion that Soviet Russia turned out to be one of the few nations which is prepared to consider the problem of Atlantis from an objective scientific point of view, as readers can notice from the article by Professor Haug-Meister and Professor Obruchev. The immense reluctance of Western science to accept Atlantis, at least as a possible hypothesis, can be described by 2 points. A. Too much specialization. Any position that lies outside the boundaries of this special branch of research is out of its field of vision. B. Laziness as a bad method for describing chunks of prehistory, work that no one wants to undertake. However, of course, it will be interesting if the first person to discover the remains of the underwater continent is the captain of a Soviet submarine crew, equipped with special photographic equipment. This note, or maybe I should say brief article, was most likely written by the editor-in-chief of Atlantis magazine, Egerton Sykes, who passed away in the year of 1983, with whom Doctor of Chemical Sciences Zhirov was in correspondence, which leads to certain thoughts. The famous Russian Atlantologist Nikolai Feodosevich Zhirov, he passed away in the year 1970. In his books Atlantis, published in 1957, and Atlantis, The Main Problems of Atlantology, 1964, for the first time defined some of the goals and objectives of the future science of Atlantology. The scientist was convinced that such a science as Atlantology has a right to exist in the modern world. He wrote that Atlantology is going through the transitional period of its development, which is characterized by its formation as a science and a departure from fantasy and pseudo-scientific fabrications. Atlantology as a science, says Zhirov, can be considered one of the sections of the biogeography of the modern Quaternary period, Anthropocene, of the geological history of the Earth. Moreover, that part of it that chronologically refers to the time of the formation of intelligent man, the time immediately preceding our historical era, starting with the last glaciation. Therefore, when studying the enigma, it is necessary to take into account not only geological but also paleobiological factors, not to mention the data of comparative mythology. The archive of the Russian Academy of Sciences houses a large collection of Zhirov's manuscripts and letters. There is also a typescript of his famous book Atlantis, The Main Problems of Atlantology. Zhirov's letters to his numerous correspondents show how the work on the book proceeded and what difficulties the author experienced during its publication. Zhirov wrote in one of his letters, "We had to urgently perform a surgical operation and almost completely exclude the historical and ethnic part of the book, leaving only what relates directly to Plato's Atlantis. Therefore, in the future book, you will not see much of what was in my last book." Unexpectedly, the manuscript of the book was even requested by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, where it was considered for several months by Comrade Ilitchov. Young people don't know today, but Leonid Fedorovich Ilitchov, who passed away in the year 1990, was the secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Central Committee from 1961 to 1965. He was a full member of the USSR Academy of Sciences, specialist in the philosophy of Marxism. It is clear how the Marxists reacted to the completely non-Marxist topic of ancient civilizations. In connection with the article in the Atlantis magazine, an interesting parallel can be drawn, which is referred to by British researcher Andrew Collins in his book The Gates of Atlantis. In the 1950s, aerial reconnaissance discovered strange man-made underwater stone structures off the coast of Cuba. Subsequently, the famous specialist in maritime archaeology, Manson Valentine, would call this find the architectural plan of an exceptionally complex urban complex. He was the first to suggest that in prehistoric times the landmass of the Great Bahama Bank and Cuba were connected by a strip of land. Collins is careful to write that according to unconfirmed reports, research has already been carried out in this building complex using a Soviet submarine. And no matter how incredible this story may seem, the fact remains it was followed by the publication of the book Atlantis in 1957 by the Soviet scientist and Atlantologist Zhirov. A more thorough work called Atlantis, The Main Problems of Atlantology, appeared in 1964. It was at that time, says Collins, that the Soviet Union, relying on these finds, conducted an active search in various areas of the Atlantic for evidence of the existence of Atlantis. This story unexpectedly had its continuation. In the year 2001, Canadian researcher Polina Zelitskaya discovered an underwater city in western Cuba that is up to 6,000 years old. Polina Zelitskaya, according to Voronin, was born in Poland, which is nonsense. She was born in Odessa, that's in Ukraine, and studied to become an engineer at one of the institutes of the Soviet Union, and I've talked about her before. During the Cold War, she was assigned to work on a secret submarine, according to Voronin, that was then in Cuban waters, after which Zelitskaya got married and moved to Canada. It can be assumed that the discoveries in Cuba were based on the results of research carried out using Soviet submarines. This was one of the quests that brought me to Yucatan, Mexico, 3 times in my life. These rumors of the Soviet subs on secret missions looking for ancient ruins in the waters there. But you need a little bit more than civilian researchers possess, and to get to the answer. But the question still remains open, by the way. Here is what I read years later in a Russian publication. The Cuban government or another force has put the brakes on all the development and research of the underwater city. At first, all the newspapers were full of headlines about it, and then abruptly there was silence, as if at someone's command it was full stop. The city is still remembered casually, without starting any research, and the pyramids of granite or something else are still standing at the depth of more than 600 meters, waiting for their time. After a while, even Zelitskaya and Weinzweig already denied that they had seen the city, and even more so that it was Atlantis. They said that they had most likely just found remnants of a local culture once located on a large land bridge connecting the Yucatan Peninsula with Cuba. Why did Cuba forbid studying a unique find at the bottom of the sea? A city that is 50,000 years old, or is it a natural phenomenon? So this was from the Russian newspaper, and now let's get back to Voronin's writings. Another mystery is posed by the archive of the Soviet scientist. And he's referring to Zhirov. On the title page of the typewritten book Atlantis, Main Problems of Atlantology, there is an inscription. The book is dedicated to Ekaterina Fyodorovna Haug-Meister. In the 1964 edition, this dedication was removed by the publisher. We know practically nothing about Haug-Meister herself. The only source is her article, The Ice Age and Atlantis, published in the Soviet Union in Nature magazine in the year 1955. However, from the correspondence between Zhirov and Haug-Meister, we learn quite interesting details about the life and work of this amazing woman. A specialist in the field of historical geography, Ekaterina Fyodorovna Haug-Meister, born Taruntsova, who lived between 1898 and 1958, was born in Tallinn, Estonia, where she lived almost her entire life. Haug-Meister wrote to Zhirov about her family ties with Yelena Petrovna Blavatsky. In a letter dated April 11, 1956, it is not customary for us to talk about Yelena Petrovna Blavatsky. Once again, it is confirmed that there is no profit in one's own country. Without getting acquainted with her books, she was condemned behind her back. But in England, in particular, this great Russian is highly valued. Sooner or later, she will be recognized in our country, and they will be proud of it. Of course, for this to happen, we must first change a lot. Maybe this has already begun. I can also add that through my grandmother, Fadeeva, St. Petersburg, I am related to Blavatsky, if not a relative, but at least a distant relative. And in our society, they sometimes complimented me that I reminded of her a little in some respects. But where should I? And that's where it stops. Haug-Meister treated her spiritual and scientific teachers with great respect, almost reverence. Rurich and Obruchev. Haug-Meister writes to Zhirov in a letter dated June 21, 1956, "You already, of course, know the sad news, the death of Vladimir Afanasyevich Obruchev. For me personally, this is a big loss. He always treated me so attentively and accurately answered all my questions. This is the second great person who treated me so cordially. I'm talking about Nikolai Konstantinovich Rurich. But you didn't know him, and you cannot judge him. He enjoyed honor and respect throughout the world, with the exception of the USSR. He died in the Himalayas and was burned there on his favorite rock. He was not only a great artist, but a herald of peace and purity. In some respects, he followed in Blavatsky's footsteps. His portrait and Obruchev's portrait are on my desk." So now I want to add something. You can read Obruchev's books in English, Plutonia and the Sunnikov Land. They will remind you of Jurassic Park, but in their own way. It's high adventure and powerful fantasy. You will not put it down. And we in the Soviet Union, young people and so forth, read those books over and over. Wonderful, wonderful imagination. Okay, let's go back. Judging by the correspondence between Zhirov and Haug-Meister, the latter was a widely educated person and had extensive connections abroad, which in itself, under Soviet times, was not so easy to maintain. She writes to her correspondent about the poet of the Russian diaspora, Georgy Golokhvastov, and his poem, The Death of Atlantis, 1938. The poem was published in New York, just 300 copies, and was unknown in the USSR. Haug-Meister shares with Zhirov her plan to write a great novel about Atlantis. The grandson, Alexander Haug-Meister, told Voronin that she wrote poetry and drew well, and something could remain in their home archive, but unfortunately, it has not yet been sorted out. So you're looking at over a decade. I don't know if it was sorted out since then. No one knows, I think, in the United States. Less well known was Haug-Meister's second activity, according to Voronin, the Occult. At one time, she collaborated in the almanac Occultism and Yoga, which was published between 1933 and 1976, whose editor-in-chief was Aseyev. She very sparingly covers this period of her life in a letter to Zhirov dated July 31, 1956. Haug-Meister writes about a personal hostile relationship with the editorial staff member Nina Rudnikova. According to Haug-Meister, Rudnikova practiced black magic, but there are no hints in how this was manifested in the letter. Nina Pavlovna Rudnikova, 1890 to 1940, played a very significant role in the Russian occult movement, especially during the years of emigration. She was one of the most active contributors to the almanac Occultism and Yoga, published in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, in the 1930s. In Estonia, Rudnikova enjoyed a reputation as the most authoritative esotericist, and as she wrote about it, Bogomolov and all serious occult cells, organizations, considered her their spiritual leader. From year to year, she conducted intensive spiritual work, had many students, and for several groups of listeners, she read in Russian, a systematic course of esotericism, theoretical and subjectively practical. Nina Pavlovna lived permanently in Tallinn, at that time called Revel. Here she was engaged in treatment with psychic energy, magnetism for a long time. She did not have a medical degree and therefore worked together with one Estonian physician, Dr. Lassman, who learned from her the great part of occult healing. At one time, Rudnikova was going to open an Institute for Psychic Energy Treatment in Tallinn, but unfortunately, wrote Voronin, this plan could not be realized. It is difficult to say why such a relationship developed between Haug-Meister and Rudnikova. Perhaps this was due to her occult treatment with psychic energy, which sometimes did not achieve a positive result. According to Rudnikova's contemporaries, she did a lot of white magic work and had considerable magical powers. Haug-Meister, in turn, became close to Indian sages, meeting them in the refuge of Religions Society. Living in Tallinn, she participated in the Congress of Parapsychologists in Oslo as the representative of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Yekaterina Fyodorovna wanted to convene the next World Congress in Estonia, but her plan failed. What was behind the confrontation between Haug-Meister and Rudnikova? Most likely, the answer can be found in the memoirs of Srezhnyovskaya-Zelentsova about Rudnikova. Some of Rudnikova's friends and acquaintances did not accept her second marriage, after which some cooling, so to say, occurred. She married Baron A.V. Ikskul, an ardent admirer of the Eastern tradition. This in turn influenced Nina Pavlovna. She began to find the great common to both traditions, the truth that belongs to all human research. Further, Srezhnyovskaya-Zelentsova wrote, once, having met Nina Pavlovna at a friend's house, I invited her to join the circle of the secret doctrine. To this, she smiled and said that she has a strange property, or trait, to destroy those organizations that she belongs to. Now, it is. Yelena Pavlovna Ryorik also had a special opinion about Rudnikova. Ryorik, in one of her letters of 1937, reproaches Aseev and Rudnikova that a certain A.V. among her followers, Pial, with which one must be extremely careful. That was the last name. According to some reports, Pial turned out to be an agent of the Soviet GPU. That's the forerunner of the KGB. Ryorik wrote, Mrs. Rudnikova wrote to me and I answered, frankly, I will tell you, her letter upsets me because in it she speaks too casually, in a Philistine way, about the concept of the Great Brotherhood, which is so hidden and high for us. Therefore, the attitude of Ryorik was not entirely favorable towards Rudnikova. Most likely, this is the root of the complex relationship between Haug-Meister and Rudnikova. Apparently, the matter was complicated by the fact that Aseev wanted to appoint Haug-Meister as editor-in-chief of the almanac Occultism and Yoga, but due to the outbreak of intrigue in the editorial office itself, she refused. In 1951, Aseev moved to Paraguay, Asuncion, and continued to publish the almanac Occultism and Yoga there. After Rudnikova's death in 1940, Haug-Meister lived in Tallinn for a long time and worked on issues of parapsychology and the occult. So I'll step aside for a moment. So she was under the Nazi occupation and then came the Soviets. And she continued to live there. I don't know what happened during those years, but let's continue. She tried to embody the torn contradictions between metaphysics and science in her work, which she carried out in Estonia and far beyond its borders. Historian of Russian Rosicrucianism, Kiselev, who passed away in 1965, once said that occultism is knowledge itself, and science is part of knowledge. Thus, Haug-Meister, to solve the unscientific problem of Atlantis, attracted the knowledge of interdisciplinary sciences, which would find application only at the end of the 20th century. The research of scientists, in the strict sense of the word, Zhirov, Obruchev, Bogachev, Haug-Meister, and others, anticipates many of the works of modern researchers working in the field of the so-called alternative history. The impetus for the revival of interest in Atlantis in the USSR, I'll repeat it again, was a discussion of major Soviet scientists and writers on the pages of the Technika Молодежи magazine in 1956, under the title Did Atlantis Exist? Famous scientists and writers who took part in the discussion: Vechinkin, Yefremov, Zhirov, Plyam, Haug-Meister. The publication of Yarina Haug-Meister also contributed a lot to this. Zhirov's books were still only in manuscript. Public interest was fueled by the increasingly new scientific data obtained by Soviet research vessels in the Atlantic Ocean. At the beginning of 1958, Ekaterina Fyodorovna moved to Leningrad, where she approached perhaps the main work of her life, the creation of the Russian Society for the Study of the Problems of Atlantis. In a letter to Zhirov dated January 2nd, 1958, Haug-Meister wrote, "If I transfer to Leningrad, then we will definitely take up propaganda of Atlantology, according to Voronin, and achieve the opening of a society for the study of the problems of Atlantis, or something in this spirit." The same idea was developed in the early 1960s by another remarkable scientist, candidate of geological and mineralogical sciences, Ilya Yakovlevich Furman, who passed away in 1983. At one of the lectures at the Voronezh Regional Komsomol Committee, Furman outlined sensational topic for that time: a new science at the intersection of geography, geology, history, and ethnography, Atlantology, its methods, tasks, and development prospects. He stated it in a letter to Zhirov in March of 1965. Furman also suggested that Zhirov create a correspondence club of Atlantologists in the USSR. Zhirov, meanwhile, is actively corresponding with the editor of the British magazine Atlantis, Egerton Sykes, and Italian publishers Leonardo Bettini and Nicola Russo. In 1930-1932, in Bari, Italy, Dr. Russo published the magazine Atlantis in Italy, in translation. And in March 1963, in Genoa, under the leadership of Bettini, the magazine Atlantis began to be published. Zhirov had high hopes for the latest edition. In his opinion, Bettini's publication was more scientific than Sykes' journal. In a letter to Haug-Meister dated January 20, 1958, Zhirov writes that he received an offer from Dr. Russo to begin organizing the Italian-Soviet Society for the Study of Atlantis. The letter also talked about publishing a magazine on Atlantis in Russian. Unfortunately, all the intentions of Haug-Meister and Zhirov to give the problem of Atlantology in the USSR the status of a new interdisciplinary scientific direction ended in failure. In January of 1958, Ekaterina Fyodorovna passed away, and in 1970, Zhirov passed away. A researcher of the Russian occult movement at the beginning of the 20th century, Bogomolov writes, "On the territory of the USSR, all organizations, both order type and individual circles, were forced to exist in the deepest underground and were mainly doomed to a closed existence." This also applied to those informal communities that were not officially registered, but that united among themselves based on interest in one or another area of science and culture, including the problem of Atlantis. As an example, we can cite such a community in Baku, Azerbaijan, where Soviet scientists and Atlantologists lived and worked for some time. Furman, Bogachev, Kovalevsky, Ivlov. To step away, you need to understand, the official ideology hated people who did not live or recognize its concepts. And stepping away to study UFOs or Atlantis, it was equivalent to a crime. How one got punished varied, but people did get punished. In 1955, Haug-Meister published in the journal Nature, which became famous not only in the USSR but abroad, the article Ice Age and Atlantis, with the afterword by academician Obruchev. In his book Atlantis, The Main Problems of Atlantology, Zhirov examines in detail the hypothesis that Atlantis became the obstacle that blocked the path of the warm Gulf Stream northward into the Arctic Ocean. This is precisely what Haug-Meister's article was devoted to. She wrote, apparently some kind of obstacle appeared that blocked the access of the southern current to the polar regions. This obstacle could only be areas of land in the Atlantic Ocean. The Ice Age began. Millennia passed. Gradually, Atlantis began to slowly sink into the waters of the ocean. Inch by inch, its northern and southern ends were hidden underwater. Finally, of the entire continent, only its central part remained. This was the Atlantis that Plato talks about and is mentioned by even more ancient authors. And there are also legends among almost all ancient peoples inhabiting the shores of the Atlantic Ocean on both the western and eastern sides. After the disappearance of Atlantis, the equatorial warm current moved in a wide stream to the north, bringing warmth to the ice-bound shores of Europe. Intensive climate warming began. The ice melted and retreated to the north. The Ice Age is over. Our hypothesis is supported by the fact that the death of Atlantis coincides with the end of the Ice Age. Haug-Meister talks about a Soviet scientific expedition on the icebreaker ship Sadko, which, using the decay of ionium, determined that the waters of the Gulf Stream penetrated the Arctic Ocean 10 to 12,000 years ago, and the increased flow of Gulf Stream waters began 3 to 5,000 years ago. American scientists obtained similar results. They examined volcanic ash, which is found in the sediments of the Atlantic Ocean. It turned out that it appeared here about 12,000 years ago. Academician Obruchev, in the preface to the article, speaks of Haug-Meister's hypothesis as follows. New data on the sea depths in the North Atlantic confirm that they were formed relatively recently, and their age approximately coincides with the dates of the sinking of Atlantis given in ancient legends. Furthermore, it is interesting to compare the time of the sinking of Atlantis and the end of the Ice Age in the Northern Hemisphere. Both of these events occurred 10 to 12,000 years ago. This suggests that it was Atlantis that was the obstacle that blocked the path of the warm Gulf Stream northward into the Arctic Ocean. The appearance of this obstacle at the beginning of the Quaternary period caused glaciation around North Pole. The sinking of Atlantis again cleared the way for the Gulf Stream, and in the north, its warm waters gradually stopped glaciation around the North Pole, while glaciation around the South Pole continues to this day. Only one fact is curious. Zhirov's archive contains a letter from one of his many correspondents, Kazansky, dated May 5, 1964. This is the scientific director of the Expeditionary oceanographic vessel Sidov, head of one of the departments of the Kaliningrad Higher Naval Hydrographic School, candidate of physical and mathematical sciences, associate professor, Colonel Engineer Mikhail Mikhailovich Kazansky. Sidov embarked on its 10th voyage. It was from February 1958 to May 1958, along the route Sevastopol, Mediterranean Sea, Gibraltar, Port of Dakar, Brazilian coast, the Azores, English Channel, Baltese, Kronstadt. Kazansky wrote, "For 7 years, I had to manage oceanographic work in the Atlantic, which was carried out from several vessels working together. We have worked repeatedly in the Azore-Gibraltar region. Here, as you have probably already heard, it was possible to discover traces of the undoubted subsidence of individual areas of land. New mountain peaks with shallow, distinctive depths above them were discovered. Branches of dead corals with pieces of substrate adhering to them were raised. Flat-top banks of the Guyot type were also found." Was it Atlantis? Who knows? On April 22, 1964, in Leningrad, at the House of Scientists, at a meeting of the Geological and Geographical section, Kazansky made a report on the location of Atlantis. According to the scientist and marine explorer, the legendary island was located at the latitude of the Azores archipelago and Gibraltar. The information is confirmed by Mitrofanov in the book Commodore, Captain. The morning of May 14, a sharp change in the echo sounder readings forced us to delay our return home somewhat. A serious find in an area with depths of about 2,500, 3,000 meters. The ship's echo sounder records a depth of 1,280 meters. This means that the expedition identified a significant local uplift of the ocean floor. In order to determine the boundaries of the unexpectedly appeared Atlantis, the Sedovites spent 9 hours ironing the special zone up and down. Deciphering the data from depth measurements allowed us to identify the characteristic elements of the zone: gentle underwater valleys, individual low peaks. The highest point of the zone is 920 meters from the ocean surface. When you consider that such an anomaly was discovered in a frequently visited area of the ocean, the cost of the discovery becomes even higher. To consolidate access in the area of the highest rise of the bottom materials collected using a soil tube. After its first descent, the tube brings solid particles and fragments of coral branches. Science and practice indicate that corals are light-loving organisms. Under normal conditions, you will not find them at depths of more than 50 meters, but here they're just a kilometer deep. The findings clearly indicate that the identified Atlantis is mute evidence of land subsidence, which by geological standards occurred quite recently. Voronin sometimes got the feeling that all the achievements of science of the 20th century about the geological history of the Atlantic Ocean remained only for narrow specialists and departmental institutions. They are isolated, almost inaccessible, and no one has made an attempt, except perhaps Atlantologists, to somehow connect them with the problem of the existence of land in the northern part of the Atlantic. Those questions and problems related to the biogeographical and geological reality of Atlantis, according to Zhirov, remained unanswered and without subsequent scientific argumentation. If there is strictly scientific evidence, then why do they try to ignore it and almost always refute it? Voronin had no answer to this question. Who was Haug-Meister? Zhirov, in the obituary dedicated to Ekaterina Fedorovna and published in Sykes' journal Atlantis, seems to emphasize the ambiguity and great creative potential of the Estonian scientist. I regret to inform you that Mrs. Ekaterina Haug-Meister, an outstanding Soviet Atlantologist, died suddenly of a heart attack on January 28, 1958. She was 60 years old. On the eve of her death, she was working on a detailed monograph of the problem of Atlantis. The unfinished manuscript and the works used are now entirely in the possession of her son, Mr. E.A. Haug-Meister, who lives in Leningrad. Mrs. Haug-Meister, an Estonian by nationality, was also famous for her work on metaphysics. I believe that all students of Atlantis mourn this loss. It remains to add that the whereabouts of the manuscript on Atlantis and works on metaphysics by Yarina Haug-Meister are still unknown. That's what Voronin wrote, and no news since then. Let's wait until the family archive of the Haug-Meister family will soon reveal its secrets to future researchers and inquisitive people. So this is what I wanted to bring to your attention today, and I will continue to bring such obscure pages of the Russian history when it comes to Atlantis, to early ufology, to paranormal research, because these people lived and they worked and they had ideas, sometimes well before any Western hypothesis. And that's good, because it's all part of the history of people on this planet. And if you like my research, please kindly support me through the links you will find in the description to this video. I appreciate it. Please tell others about my research. Please like my videos and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.